And of course, iTunes, and of course, the aforementioned Daniel Cormier will be on at 125, who, of course, this has been discussed a lot, of course, with Fedor versus Chael Sonnen, and of course, what he's become since then. And at the very top of that list, of course, is the one and only Quinton Rampage Jackson. And of course, now the Bellator heavyweight / light heavyweight champion. I mean, of course, there was a time, not to bring up the past, but there was a time where you weren't talking to me for a little bit. And then, of course, in 2008. And then, of course, defeated him at UFC 92. Headlining act, of course, is DC moving up to heavyweight. He went to the gym with you and all that stuff. Of course, and the card is phenomenal, of course. 223 was great, too, but then, of course, it was ravaged with all the craziness. Michael Chiesa versus Anthony Pettis, I mentioned 223, of course. And then, of course, the double header as far as... And the difference is, of course, you're being asked to do that, to do little things like that. Of course, you're getting more attention. 2006, of course, I remember it. We heard, of course, from Daniel Cormier. Still to come, of course, Derek Lewis. You could look at Bellator, of course. But, of course, we saw you not that long ago in Brooklyn. And Chael Sonnen, of course, and Dan Henderson. And, of course, the great knockout over Sean Salmon. Of course, you became champion. What a moment it was. And, of course, they had some shows a few months back. Yes, of course. Fighters, of course, who came on, of the fans, and, of course, the help and support. Of course, his friend Tai Tuivasa. And, of course, Robert Whitaker won. When you guys were talking to them, of course. And Carlos Esparza, of course, it was the first time that I had the opportunity to actually see. That's the 2-horse race, of course. Of course, one of the big stories, CM Punk. Megan Anderson is really big compared to Holly Holm. And, of course, you figured it out. Sage Northcutt getting back in there, of course, against Kimbo, of course. And, of course, John Fitch. And then, of course, you know, we evolved. We went to a new studio. Of course, it was tight, but I just wanted to show that work. I mean, of course, your calves, of course. And, of course, the big news was, and of course, the other big news. And so we have a lot to discuss. And then, of course, I'm talking about Michael Bisping. I didn't say this to you at the time, of course. And, of course, as they would say in England, of course. And then, of course, the win on Friday, of course, beat Cody Bollinger, you know, an injury. Of course, when it's we've had a lot of names. Of course, we've also had, of course, good luck this weekend. From this past weekend, of course, you met him on this show a couple of months ago, of course. First being, of course, the Marlon Moraes, and of course, what happened on Saturday, the craziness. Of course, the reaction is card. Of course, we all remember UFC 189. Of course, we remember last year. Of course, I reached out. Of course, I had to ask. Yeah, of course, the most famous one is John Jones, which of course has been immortalized. And of course, he was crying and the crying Jordan. Then we get to the co-main event, of course, that of course we had all been foaming at the mouth about. I will talk to Israel Adesanya, of course, one of the big winners, and then of course taking your foot off the gas. And of course, we are now counting when of course there was once the smashes version and all that, and had the issues, of course, until of course they match him up against someone and I don't. And of course, thank you to my parents, and thank you to my mom, who never missed an episode, and who, of course, and then of course the win on Friday, of course, and of course, thank you to my parents.
And you have to have a professional man behind that wheel.
Now, it seems to me if we want to get one house in order, we ought to get them all in order.
That she was going to look into this and have things taken care of. Not a thing was done. A qualified tree surgeon, $13,000 riding behind a wheel of a truck.